and it's
I
not
don't know why.
user friendly.
No worries. So then, okay, got it. Okay. And then go ahead and start your record.
Okay, so we are streaming live on YouTube. Great. And the doors are open. We're in business. Guys, we're good to go finally. Why is this not charging though? That's my question. Okay. Now I'm good. All right. I will restart just because we are now streaming on YouTube and we are recording. I will call to order this March 9th meeting of the Moab City Planning Commission at 6:02 p.m. In attendance, we have planning commissioners, myself, Kaya Marienfeld, Miles Lofton, Ruben Villapando Salas, city planning staff, Christina Dillard Crawford, Corey Shirtliff, our planning director, is in attendance virtually. And we are ready to go. First item on the agenda is citizens to be heard. So we do have a couple folks who are here in the audience. Are you all here for citizens to be heard this evening? To clarify, citizens to be heard is for something that is not on the agenda. For Cottonwood. Okay, great. We can have you come provide comments at that time or see if you want to engage then. We did not receive any other citizens to be heard general comments about anything. We did receive comments about the level 2 site plan application for the Cottonwood condominiums, which is our one and only action item tonight. So that said, we will move on to our action item 3.1. A proposed planning resolution number 02-2023, a planning resolution conditionally approving the level 2 site plan application for the Cottonwood condominiums 2022 on property located at 214 South, 200 East, Moab, Utah, 84532. So this is a briefing and a possible action. I imagine we'll be getting a lot of background updates from Corey about this item, as well as there being a pretty extensive agenda summary and attachments that hopefully everyone had a chance to read as we review them. Corey, you want to take it away? And then if there's an appropriate time, I'll make sure that y'all can come up and say what you came to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Kaya. With the citizens in the chambers tonight, I'm not sure how we want to organize that or to which direction they'd like to speak. The way that my intention to frame this discussion tonight is background as to why we're seeing this item in the format that we are, a review of the original item in its context, and then moving on to some of the clarification that is required. And in body, we're going to walk through the entire criteria for approval tonight. So it is going to be extensive and very detailed, but I think it's necessary to establish an understanding for the Planning Commission of how to make a decision on this item. So that being the framework, for me, what I would not want to have happen with the citizens is that we're getting into a back and forth. So for me, it's almost more helpful, I think, to have any commentary that the chair wants to bring first, and that way those can be addressed during the presentation. Unless, I guess, in the chambers, you'd like me to engage into this presentation framework and then near the end have commentary, where I'm hoping some of these questions may be resolved, but I'm going to leave it up to you, Kaya, how you'd like to organize this tonight.
Yeah, great. I might have the folks who were here come up and say what they like to say, provide comment at the outset. That way you can address things, we can address things, we can make sure that we're coordinating. I have some questions for you. I'm sure other commissioners do as well. Maybe we can have those after the presentation if they're not addressed. And then does that sound good? Presentation.
That makes sense to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So if y'all want to come up, either one at a time or together, whatever you prefer, please introduce yourself. Make sure you're talking into the microphone. Our folks taking minutes need to be able to hear you, as well as the people watching on YouTube. Hello.
Hello, I'm Vert Birds. We have the property to the west,
Okay, great.
where Snook's property's at. Been involved with irrigating this piece of property for many years. It's been in the family for 100 years before it became Snook's. Originally along the west side, there was a 2 foot by 1 foot deep ditch to catch the irrigation water and keep it from going into the property that we still have. The drainage for this project comes around the east side, down the south side, along the west, and then goes through an 8-inch pipe into the retention pond. They're going to use a 12-inch pipe that's existing and cut into the storm drain, which is great. This property will see everything in water that gets in there. You got leaves, you got animals, you got cotton from the cottonwoods, elms, tree seeds. With the movement of the FEMA map being redrawn last year,
Mhm.
they're having to make some changes to the fencing on the west side that has openings to allow water to move back and forth. I'd like to see that west side is built to where water cannot come off of the condominium property onto the property to the west. If last year's flood was a 100-year flood, the water was probably 5 to 6 feet below the existing property that you're building on. If you do a rough look at it from Google Earth, it's approximately 7 feet difference between 100 East, where all the flood water went, and Snook's property. I don't see, I don't see the requirements for this type of fence that they're looking at putting on there. With the 8-inch pipe that goes underneath the paved part, if that becomes plugged, you have another retention pond with no overflow,
Mhm.
and it will go to the west. That's our concern.
Yeah, I'm looking at the vicinity map right now. That makes sense to all of you. Corey, could you hear that well?
I did. I took notes on that to comment later with potentially a conditional approval amendment that could incorporate those elements.
Great.
We'd talked, I talked to the contractor about just a bit pouring a cement wall along there.
Hmm.
And it's the floodplain was actually way west of that. It doesn't even go, it wasn't even up to the house that we still have on the property to the west. Now it's on the east side of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Places that didn't flood are on the FEMA map, and places that did flood are not on the FEMA map. So
Yeah.
That's a concern we have.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. So to be clear, you are the home that is, if you're on 200, it's behind the property that's being developed,
180 east, 200 south.
where all the deer are on the bike path.
Yeah.
Okay, I ride by there a lot. Thank you very much. Okay. Maybe, yeah, Corey, would you like to give your presentation, give some backgrounds? My main questions, I will say just at the outset, so maybe you can address them as you're presenting. The big thing was the buffer. I read the entirety of the appeal and the comment letter that we were provided by the other adjacent property owner, and I'm concerned about the buffer requirements. It does read pretty plain language to me, but I'm curious what it actually is and what's coming in. Whether this resets the clock on the AEH for the developer. And then I would love to hear about the drainage as well. Any other things to preface from y'all?
Statute things are the main focus for me. anyways.
What was that?
Exactly.
Yeah,
the buffering.
Yeah, the buffering.
Yeah.
Talking to you. Okay, thanks, Corey.
Perfect. Thank you. I will jump into our presentation here. Let me cue it up.
It's down the street from you.
It is.
I walked by it today.
Yep, so did I.
Okay. All right, everyone. Well, again, thank you for your attendance tonight for this item. We're wanting to give as much attention to clarifying within the structure so that as the planning commission moves forward, it's very comfortable and solid on its findings for decision. And then as we advance into this discussion, we can, with this item moving forward with an appeal application filed, engage in those next steps. So already being mentioned, this was a condominium project approved by Planning Commission during August of 2022. And following the months working towards the building permit, the property neighbor to the direct adjacent to the south was in communicating with the planning department, finding they were submitting an appeal for this decision. Now, with that appeal decision, the review of the approval sets and plans was engaged, and through that, the applicant team, the city acknowledged that there was a deficiency in the noticing procedures for the applicant. And then within that, in order to cure without any doubt, the applicant had requested that we re-review this item after they had noticed in a form approved by the city to the adjacent neighbors. So that's why we're seeing this item again in this context. So this may address part of the discussion of where the application is that the entitlements for the application being submitted, which happens at a site plan application submittal stage, is that the submittal materials were complete, meaning it was intact under that original application number. This is not removing the entitlements. So this does not re-engage as a incomplete item. Therefore, the vesting remained intact, meaning it is not re-engaged with AEH at this point. All we're doing is, this would be, the context for this is very similar to if, for whatever reason, with noticing for a public hearing, the outward noticing with a newspaper or something had a defect in that, and we needed to redo the public hearing. Or, for example, we're not streaming correctly or something was wrong with YouTube. So the item has remained intact despite it being such a long period between the original approval and now. The application itself is remained complete and intact, but the approval needed to be redone and brought before Planning Commission at the request of the applicant. Sorry, that was a little clunky, getting warmed up. So with that in mind, this presentation outlines essentially the original review of the application. We didn't want to take any components out. We left it mostly intact, and then we'll be adding to it for further clarification. So we're all fairly familiar with the location of the property at this point, just under half acre in the R3 zone along the Mill Creek Pathway, with the proposed residential multi-household use condominiums use by nature, and then a 9-unit count on that. So within this vicinity map, that Mill Creek Pathway identified as the city right-of-way to the north. Our neighbor that presented just a bit, Bert Burton's property to the west, and then Keith Harder's the appellant to the south. This was the lighting and landscaping plan originally presented to the Planning Commission. And this identifies and tries to highlight some of the specifically open space as it's associated with the particular use, and landscaping components, particularly within plants and other landscaping features that are included. Now, within this elevation design, we can see what would be the north at the bottom, north facing south, frontage or front door. So frontage being a word we're going to talk about tonight. So there are frontages of properties. and facades also being another important key factor here. But this is the front doors, if we're going to call them that, of the property facing the north. And then this being the south looking north elevation with back doors, so to speak, into those little patio areas, which is going to be the side yard. These elevations showing, if we're looking west to east, the patio overhangs that are located along that south border, I think wanting to identify those as well. Now, obviously with this background, it was included in the packet. I don't want to dive too deep into that, but wanting to have it presented. So the benchmarks of where we were at with this application are very clearly defined. What I might comment on as we get about halfway down through this is just reading verbatim. Following the receipt of an appeal application, the applicants, meaning Gary Snook, elected to cure the procedural notice defects that were cited in the original approval process through resubmitting to the Planning Commission through this site plan approval as planning resolution. So a new planning resolution. This is a new action being taken on an existing item, not unlike we would have for any other defects that we're curing. The city's wanted to accommodate this action in line with the policies for re-reviewing items. The application status has remained intact as a complete application and will be reviewed in the municipal code context of which it was approved, meaning any code amendments, which there have not been any outside of the AEH, I think having been changed since this application has come through. Okay. This is the original narrative provided by the applicants. Obviously, the metrics for this have not changed much outside of the completion description of completing of the construction. This is, as we do normally, including a recommended motion with essentially the same language intact as it was previously on the application, that they need to resolve the condominium component as an additional application and approval process that needs to go through the Planning Commission, and then the lighting getting defined out as we actually go to installation through the building process. Now to back up a little bit further, and again, thank you for your patience, is to loosely point out this the identification of this noticing component. So I'll stop sharing screen for just a moment and highlight specifically in the code where that's identified. And I believe material wise, something I'd like to actually get a response from the commission on is that in order to provide as much information, we provided the appeal application for the Planning Commission to review, hopefully with enough time for you to review that. But then also the appellant Keith Harger had provided a statement specifically for the Planning Commission. Has everyone had a chance to read that? If not, we're certainly going to dive into it. We have it open, but if it's needing to be brought up in a much more full review, we can do that.
Yes, we all have that. I'm looking at a paper copy right now that I printed just for my own reference, but everyone
I had a
received
chance-
that.
to look at it. Yeah.
Great.
The answer was yes. Sorry, everyone.
Yes, sorry,
Okay.
Corey, yes.
Thank you. Okay, we'll go ahead and advance then. I have many windows open, so please be patient as I shuffle through a few of these. Okay, thank you. All right. So what we're seeing in this section is our site plan review section of the code, chapter 1767. Within that chapter, there's review procedures outlined specifically under a level 2 application. What we're looking at here is this particular component of a level 2 definition. If it'll let me highlight it, please. Here we are. Upon this, the applicant, meaning the property owner developing, shall deliver notice of a pending application in the form approved by a city to the adjacent property owners, who shall be permitted to submit written comments or testimony as to the compliance of the application and applicable approval criteria and city ordinances. It does go on to say any written comments or testimony from the adjacent property owners or interested parties may be considered by the Planning Commission in reaching its decision. As we've gone through in the last 3 years, nearly 4, with this, members of the commission and members of staff, the understanding of this being that the applicants need to reach out to the property owners. Now, there have been forms loosely allowed, essentially saying that it's necessary for the applicants to reach out. The applicants had reached out to the property owner, or excuse me, the adjacent property owner, Keith, in May, when the formal application was submitted, and had actually supplied plan sets as well. And I think Keith identifies that both in his appeal and in his comments. But what I think we're identifying here, and this is what the applicant wanted to clear up, is that beyond a doubt, they're now submitting a formalized letter. So, which is something obviously within our code, we're going to formalize and then probably take on responsibility so that the clarification doesn't need to be made anymore of how that is to be done. Let's move on to a review of the project at this point. Okay, thank you for your patience. Here we go. Okay. So my attempt to jump and move between some of these being I apologize, everyone. My screen is not allowing me to access the top bar of this PDF. So I'm unable to toggle between these. All right, hopefully this should be sufficient for everybody. So this is the letter submitted to the Planning Commission from Keith Harder. This was also included in the agenda packet. This is what essentially the planning staff or reviewing planner will produce or internally review through every application. We essentially bring in an application, pull every section of relative code into its context, and then check box by box through that process in the DRT review for compliance. The number of DRT reviews often have components where, yes, it's compliant here, and then other sections where it's not. And then upon completion of a DRT review, not just being within the planning code, but the building code, engineering standards, those will be resolved and then sent to Planning Commission, hopefully in a complete format, other than when conditions of approval are required. And then lastly, this is the current plan set for the development. What I'd like to do is just walk through generally what the comments are made by Keith, and then toggle to the plan set itself, and then also the criteria, and run through that all together. Keith has brought up some good points within reviewing the code. And in general, I want to say that if we were to look at any individual section of code, I think an analysis similar to how Keith has portrayed it would be, it makes some sense. But what is required of us is that we look at the general and complete sections of code and how they interact with each other, especially within our existing code, where there are multiple provisions that are working together or sometimes in combat with each other. And it is our job to interpret the most accurate interpretation of that. And that's when we go into the criteria, there are sections where it understands that codes aren't always perfect and that the way the code languages relate often require some level of interpretation. So with that, I want to value Keith's observations, but also say from the planning's perspective, we see those, but have reviewed this in the context of the more complete code, we're not necessarily taking always the strictest code or the least restrictive code. We're taking the code as it is relative to each other and how it needs to relate. Obviously, I think within the planning side, the most evident area of clarification needed is within the buffering section. In Keith's document, he also relies on the definitions of yard and setback, which are good considerations to also be incorporated here. He also looks at the understanding of how encroachment works within those areas, what exemptions or exceptions are permitted. We'll leave surface drainage to a little bit later. So evaluating the site, I just want to get us oriented again quickly. This being at the top of your screen, the Mill Creek pathway, and then to the south, Mr. Harder's property. Now, what I'd like to identify in a couple spots are some setback boundaries that were drawn onto the property, especially here in the south. We can see that the 7-foot setback, is identified by this hashed mark, the top hashed mark. Along the north, this, was there a comment? I'm sorry.
No.
Okay, thank you. This 15-foot being the front yard setback. Wrapping around, you can see that dashed line continues as the side yard. So these are both the side yards as this is identified as the frontage or front of the parcel. Not the development intact itself or the use of the property, but the lot frontage, and this being the rear yard setback of 12 feet. So within that buildable area, we have to identify the buffering component, yard unobstructions or yard intact in itself, and then landscaping. The grayed out area here is the main structure of the building, the main facade. There are patios with deck portions and overhangs also attached here. They are identified as being within the buildable envelope, not encroaching into the side yard setback standard, but they are encroaching into what would have been a 15-foot buffer space without mitigation, if we want to put it that way for the moment. There's also what is identified as this gravel walk as opposed to asphalt or concrete. And our detention basin being in the northwest section of the property. And then there 200 square feet of dedicated open or rec space.
Corey, sorry, can you go back
Yeah.
to that?
Sure.
Where it says patio walls to allow for drainage, bottom left, can you explain that? That's hard to conceptualize a little bit. So yeah, right where you're.
Yeah,
next to where
right
your
here.
cursor is. Yeah. I'm looking at the elevation plan. It's hard for me to wrap my mind around what that is showing specifically.
Right. I think that this section of the civil will have call outs for their drainage plan. And this is something where if we want to attack drainage, I think there's a couple concepts. One, and we heard it from the review, and I think also from the planning commission, is one is the buffering, one is drainage, and one is irrigation. So buffering is where I'd like to stay for the time being, but this does show components of the drainage. So we'll be able to circle back to that. And this is quite small, I'm sure, for everybody. I'll try to enhance it. Let's see. fit it all in. Is that viewable for everyone? It was in the packet and it is available for anybody watching. Is that sufficient to at least identify what we're talking about?
Yeah,
Okay.
yes.
Again, this is the criteria review that we pull for every application that we review. And obviously it changes per use, but this is the format in which we review items. So with under that multi-household dwellings component, forgive me, we're going to go line by line through this for the most part, is that it is under a section of multi-household that is more than 7 units, as it is identified as 9 units. Access, parking, garage and carports. What I'd like is for, if anybody needs more information on these that are in white, just to speak up, we can dive into those. I've identified the areas that are more in need of clarification in this orange or reddish hue. So within landscaping, it's kind of being the first clarification component of all off-street parking. So within this landscaping, specifically to off-street parking, meaning for larger apartment structures, condominiums where there are parking lots. What is unique about this property is that it is within this threshold, but being approached from a multiplex, like a triplex, fourplex fashion, meaning the parking lot is not what we think of when we think of a large commercial parking lot. But nonetheless, trying to apply this landscaping standard of all off-street parking shall be landscaped and buffered from adjacent uses. A minimum of 15% of the interior of the parking lot shall be landscaped. The comment and clarification we want to make here is the off-street parking is buffered from adjacent uses consistent with the methodology used in approval on all other similar type approvals. Moving directly into buffering here. So the first consequence is this, that we have to identify the term of use versus property. So use is typically associated with a particular element of a property. So there are uses and then structures that house those uses. And uses often, because of our review system, are identified as the reviewable area of that use. So if you think about it of, say, commercial use, somebody that is a service establishment is within that service establishment area, but that use isn't necessarily tied to that property because that use can change, as well as other properties that are surrounding that currently don't have an associated use. Their current use would be, say, undeveloped. They have capacities for uses, of course. So how we use use as a measuring tool is really challenging. In this context, what we're looking is for associated reviewable areas either being a structure or reviewable commercial or reviewable floor area is how we identify the use to be measured from. So this being one of the first areas where the clarification of use is challenging. Under buffering, the second requirement, all adjacent uses shall be buffered by a distance of not less than 15 feet and contain berms, shrubs, or other plantings. Buffering may be combined with screens, fences, and hedges. Again, I'm marking this as that it does, yes, comply with a mitigated combination of areas of horizontal landscaping and vertical screening. Now, as we've been developing our landscape ordinance and identifying this as an area that needs clarification, is that a standard buffer, as it would be permitted, can purely be a horizontal distance, meaning 15 feet with, as landscaping is defined, is plantings to the lowest degree of 1% live living plant material in combination with other materials. I know we've talked a lot about that. So essentially could be all combinations of rock or gravel with a few or even one potential plant. Now, buffering being a horizontal distance there, 15 feet is the requirement. What we're seeing on this plan is the combination, as it's identified, of vertical screening and horizontal buffering, which can be used in combination and mitigation. Where I'd like to jump, well, let me read this clarification really quick. There's a discrepancy how adjacent uses are defined and measured. We've just gone over that. The interpretation since 2019 has been that use constitutes a structure or reviewable floor area, not a zone or property, as those are identified currently in other sections. So we know that they were identified and to be used in these other sections. In cases where adjacent uses are located near a shared property line, the property development will need to be buffered proportionally to the measured distance, along with other buffering and screening measures. Meaning we have properties right now that were built near a property line where that horizontal distance would impact into the adjacent property further, if that makes sense. So we had a property that was built with structures or the reviewable use area really close to the property line. Therefore, that distance was needing to be further into the developing property versus a property that was sharing a mitigated buffer area. So we think about it right now in our code as it is now is a 10-foot offset of driveways, but it doesn't define on who is responsible for how much of that. So if somebody were to develop one driveway first and it's near to the property line, it's first come, first serve. The next person has to go 10 feet away from that, regardless of how deep into their property. Now, this is something we're trying to resolve, not only in that driveway context, but also in this context. The reason I bring it up is to identify that this is a consequence throughout our code. And in order for clarification, we are identifying, trying to resolve these. Let me pick back up here.
So Corey, real quick
Yeah.
to clarify. So what you're essentially saying in this provision is that setbacks, buffering, two different things. Buffering is dependent on adjacent property use and existing structures instead of, so essentially if you have two undeveloped properties and a fence, the property line, whichever property develops first, wherever they end up developing, the buffer may need to be made up in the property that develops second in order to have adequate buffering.
Correct. Essentially, yes. Unfortunately, that is the way it reads because
Yeah,
we
that
have
stinks.
multiple definitions where it exists. So where we've seen this recently was the Cane Creek condominiums.
Yeah.
They provided a 15-foot buffer with no screening because the adjacent use to that was directly near the property. Yet on a different portion of that property, which, as it was stated, 15 feet around as a zero vertical, but utilizing horizontal, it would have required basically a 15-foot belt, so to speak. But part of my point is that we've been interpreting this consistently since 2019, prior to me as the director. And so in this consistency, we're trying to be as fair and concise as we can within the code, both to the developer and to the adjacent use, whether that be a neighbor, undeveloped property, or other commercial property. What I mean is that this other particular property was 15 feet, and another location was less than that. I think it was 7 feet, but they were mitigating with screening at that point from their reviewable area. So again, it is complex, and that's why I think when we're reading this as a plain component or a standalone component, it is seemingly more clear. But as we get further into the code sections, we'll see how this combination component becomes more solid and is needing to be reviewed fairly for the developer as well. We can't select particular sections of code and only enforce those. We have to enforce all sections of the code. And again, this is why the review and revamp of our code for clarifications is so important, especially now more than ever. And this leads into the kind of the second half of this. Buffering and buffering areas allow for mitigated and improved combinations of horizontal and vertical landscaping. This discusses the 15% purely horizontal if no vertical screening elements are included. Thus, if they include screening, the structural, and depending on how intense they include that screening, and then whatever vegetation they include as well, reduces the horizontal buffering component, if that makes sense. Thus, the setback becomes a horizontal default for at least the structure components. And I'm going to go a little bit, well, in the justification period, what a more clear language prospect might be, and that what it does not say currently is that proposed uses shall be set back not less than 15 feet from property lines versus adjacent uses. And I hope that helps clarify of when now I'm needing to enforce off of use versus a defined meets and bounds area.
Yeah,
If that helps.
yes, that's
I'm
very helpful.
I'm going to go jump down to a further section in the code that is not related to this property, but I think is important to help clarify, again, solidifying why this rationale is the way it is that on a zone boundary between a commercial, so we think about our C4 zone, and then a rural zone or residential zone like an R2 or R3, high difference of use. So I mean, intensity of uses are very different, clearly just by the nature of the zones there. This particular provision is designed specifically for that. Buffering between zones is a buffer of 10 feet of landscaping and opaque screen or fence shall be installed and maintained along commercial zoning boundaries other than streets that abut residential zones. It talks about the 6-foot height requirement there, and where differences in elevation, it shall be the higher elevation to ensure that they're getting the full 6 feet of closure. The justification component I want to say here is that a zone boundary buffering is only required to maintain a 10-foot horizontal space with a 6-foot opaque fence. What we're looking at with this particular property and these particular uses within the same zone is what could be a 15-foot horizontal or a mitigated 6-foot fence with less. In this case, on a side yard being the closest component would be 7 feet. So we're seeing a residential being proposed and approved here at a 7-foot or just over 7 foot from the patio sections, not even the main frame of the structure, which is 17 feet, but at 7 foot with a 6-foot vertical. And again, what I'm trying to highlight here is that a zone boundary is only 10 feet horizontal and 6 feet vertical. So if we're saying two uses, one is more intense, but of the same use needs to be 15 feet plus screening, is a little offset, which is again how some of this determination back in 2019 was made. Are there any questions and clarification on that? This is the meat of buffering, certainly.
It's that gravel sidewalk that is 7 feet up to a 6-foot wall. That's correct.
Let's jump over here. So let's go up to let's go to the first page here. Along this south boundary, and again, we're not just wanting to focus on Keith's property, but also on the west boundary. The north boundary being somewhat unique in that it is not a residential property. So here we have the identifications of the 6-foot fence, and as Vert had pointed out, a design required for fences being put into the FEMA floodway, or floodplain, excuse me, not floodway, but then this gravel walk. So on a horizontal scope, we have a 6-foot fence, a gravel walk, and then components of landscaping that include different vertical green screens, vertical shrubs, and they're identified on that landscaping plan that was included of the different types of species that are being included, grasses and evergreen species, as well as trees, and then pony walls, essentially small foundation type walls to delineate space of the individual yards that are not individually owned, I will say, but yes, individually used probably by intention. So again, this being the main frame of the structure, which again is how setbacks are measured, but we do obviously accommodate for accessory structures or extensions of that to not encroach upon the setback, which is the 7 feet. So Ruben, your point of what is within that 7 feet is gravel and landscaping components with wall, shrubs, and grasses.
So I think, Corey, that brings me back to my question about what's shown as the walls, which I think is illustrated maybe as a swale. It's really hard to tell with the elevation plan and with the landscaping what that actually is. Is that another physical tall barrier, or is that just like a little 2 foot off the ground, little like landscaping barrier around the patio or the yard or something like that? Because I think that at least in the information that and Mr. Harger provided, those are denoted as private courtyard walls. And I'm not sure that that is illustrative of what it actually is. I'm very curious about that.
Right. And that's a very fair question.
It's really hard to tell.
Yeah, my understanding of that description of those areas is that they're half walls or low walls. They're not exceeding viewing height, meaning 6 feet. They're not wall enclosures. That was my understanding of it. That being said, the provisions within our landscaping code, which is a good segue to maybe jump down to our definitions section, which was included. Is again, the relation of a setback, and then by association is considered yard to be within that setback, and what can be included within a yard is determined as landscaping. And again, going through our landscaping ordinance review as we are currently, we understand how deficient that is in exact descriptions of what can be included. It's very open at the moment. Landscaping means a combination of trees, plants, shrubs, vines, ground cover, flowers, or lawns. In addition, the combination or design may include rocks and such structural features as foundations, pools, artwork, screens, walls, fences, or benches. But such objects alone shall not qualify as landscaping. The selected combination of objects for landscaping purpose shall be arranged in a harmonious manner as determined by the zoning administrator. That is what we're needing to review this as. And so when we see these walls, combinations of grasses, plants, private lawns, and the understanding, I'm understanding them as half walls, not as full engineered division walls, would be permitted in this setback, let alone in the buildable areas, certainly. While we're here, I want to highlight the buffering definition to help supplement that further. A buffer means a landscape screen, solid fence, berm, swales, or other features that individually or in combination reduce the impact of a land use on adjacent areas. And I'm going to read that again. Means a landscaped screen, solid fence, berms, swales, or other features that individually or in combination reduce the impact of a land use on adjacent areas, which are of significantly different character, density, or intensity. Buffers consist of a horizontal distance from a line, which may only be occupied by screening, underground utilities, retention areas, landscaping, or fencing materials. The more different the use of the adjoining property, the more dense or extensive the buffering may be. Now I want to jump back to our plan here. And so in this evaluation, what we're seeing is essentially series of screening systems in the form of shrubs, grasses, trees, half walls, and then a 6 foot wall, all of which of this location, based on those definitions, is considered acceptable landscaping areas or landscaping uses or combinations of uses for landscaping, including this gravel walks. And this has been identified as semi-public. It is in no way public or dedicated to the city or dedicated in any way as easement. It's meant to be private for the use of these properties, not unlike other residential uses that utilize multiple accesses. So if you have a back door that you walk out to your garage and then exit that way would not be dissimilar from that. So while we're here on that component, are there any other questions so far?
So I am looking back at the elevation plan now and at the side elevation, the west elevation,
Sure.
you can see
You can see that pony wall.
the little wall, it's like a little, just, hey, this is my yard area to delineate my yard from your yard next door. But it certainly doesn't seem more than chest height, and that seems like it would fit in the definition of what is permitted landscaping within the buffer as well as within the setback. That's the only thing at all structurally or could be construed structurally within that 7-foot setback, which is you can't change this number. It depends on the property line, correct, Corey?
That's correct. So setback, yes.
Yep.
And there we have here, we can review the definitions for setback, which is a distance from a property line. And then the component of that yard is associated to that area of what can be used within a setback is defined as yard, and what
Yeah.
yard can be included with is landscaping, and what can be included in landscaping is those things we've just mentioned.
Got it. So buffer can be mitigated, can be sort of ephemeral based on this use, adjacent uses, intensity, distance. It's a combination 15 for a use like this, but it's a little squishy, like, to be honest, it's not as clearly defined, where a setback is a specific delineated number from the property line.
Correct.
So if, for example, part of the main structure were within the required setback on the side, on the frontage, or on one of these lines, that would be a very clear code violation.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
While we have this elevation, if we can imagine the property line, which would be just off of that, wall by a matter of whatever the gravel was, and maybe just a touch more, is this horizontal distance. If we can picture this in our minds and kind of lock this in where we can see the main frame of the structure, but then also the extension of this patio and deck. We're going to jump back down to our setback and definitions quickly. Setback means the shortest distance between the property line and the foundation wall or main frame of the building. Now, it doesn't mean that decks can go all the way to the property line either, both for fire separation purposes, sorry.
It's okay.
As well as setback separations. And now there's additionally another building setback definition to identify, which means a line within the lot or a parcel of land so designated on the plat, the proposed subdivision, between which line the adjacent boundary of the pond street. Okay, this is the part that is really important. Sorry for the run up to that. Is the erection of an enclosed structure or portion thereof is prohibited. Now, this is the section that from staff gives us the authority to prevent people from putting connected pergolas or connected structures into the setback, both for fire separation purposes and for setback structure, unobstructed to the sky, which is what part of the yard definition is. But again, going back to how we have to analyze all components of the code is if we were to take the one setback structure definition, it purely says main frame of the structure. Yet in combination with this other one, which is challenging. We need to consolidate these, yes, but at the moment we have to take in consideration all components of the code. And within the yard, setback means an open space of the same lot, unobstructed from the ground upward, meaning it's not covered or enclosed. Nothing really regarding walls, screening, or kind of semi-vertical components. It just is intended to mean if you're not covering and enclosing portions of that yard that don't meet the exceptions.
Yeah. So if the patios and the overhang were within the 7-foot setback, that would be an issue. They are not.
Correct.
all we have at all structurally within the 7-foot setback, not the 15-foot squishy buffer between properties, is the little kind of wall around the yard area.
Correct. Correct.
If that
And
were
now-
a pergola, if that were an overhang, if it were something that was obstructing in some way, that would be a different issue. But because that is not, we're not in that territory.
That is correct. I'm
Only
going to
because
switch.
if
Oh,
I
go ahead,
could.
Ruben.
Yeah,
Only
Ruben?
because I couldn't find the numbers on that. How far away is the top of the awning? That part of the structure from, like, how far in is that for the?
Oh, gosh, it looks like it's about maybe
If you have that,
10,
Kai, I
10
will,
feet, 10 feet. I'm just estimating, looking
Yeah.
at the,
I can switch back if you, yeah, I might as well.
That was one of the ones
Um,
I
Site plan
couldn't find.
though, that patio in the middle of the structure
Mhm.
does seem particularly close to that setback. It's not over it, but it
Yep.
is very near to it,
yeah, it's probably
right there where your cursor is.
9 feet in from the property line, I think, just
And a
as,
couple feet away from that required setback.
Correct. Correct. And again, when we look at the property rights of a buildable area, or what we call the building envelope, is that, say, for example, a single household property wanted to come in and develop this site, they could build to that 7 foot with the main frame of their structure and then have their eave actually encroach over another 2 feet. So again, by use, if we had a less dense use, the building mass does not change. In fact, it actually gets more intense perceivably. So this is, again, form-based code that we don't have. We have traditional Euclidean zoning, use-based. But if we were off of a form-based code purely, that we might be able to mitigate something like that. So my point is, that little dashed line that we saw that ran the whole perimeter of the property for building envelope could have been enclosed and having the eaves encroach. So when we're looking at this from a condominium multi-household use perspective, there are mitigations added to that. But I don't want the perception to be that because it's 9, it's worse as far as the building itself goes, so to speak.
yeah, no, I mean, you have your legal requirements and we're just making sure that things meet legal requirements.
Absolutely.
So what you're essentially saying, and what seems reasonably clear at this point, is that they could have had the patio at 7 feet from the property line.
Correct. That is what I'm saying
Yeah.
right now. That's right.
But it's back a little off of that, so, you
Correct.
know, it clearly needs
Well,
to,
within,
Is this the one?
what?
Can I take a look at this?
Yeah, sure. It's half of it. Here's the other half. Thank you, Corey. This has been very, very informative.
I appreciate your patience as we work through this. It's very important to me that the planning commission understand the code, and as the land use authority makes a decision on this, obviously with staff recommendation of our review, but based on the evidence you're seeing and the criteria we're looking at, this gets down to, on both sides, the neighbor and their rights, but also the developer and their rights, that it must be exactly correct. So that's what I'm wanting to give patience to walking through any questions, any concerns, or any education of how it's been done or what that might mean.
And I'm particularly interested because this is the one meeting I didn't attend last year. I was looking at the minutes. So when the original approval came through, it's ironic.
And getting back to the drainage on these walls, since we're here, is likely similar to that we've seen with the mitigated FEMA fencing style, is that any drainage that is captured within this patio section would be calculated and discharged from that area in a directional way to eventually locate itself in the detention basin, so that it would not be detaining the water here, it would be retaining or discharging it at a calculated rate. Okay, so if we're going to move, I want to kind of continue to charge ahead. This was identified as one of the concerns Keith had. He did not provide this within his more current comments to the Planning Commission, but it identifies apartments and court apartments within their landscaping area. Now, this project did provide the 200 square feet of open space or rec definition area, which can be defined as recreation, play, or landscaped area. Again, a section of the code that we're evaluating for clarification and want to provide a better outcome. Where Keith's concern came in is that already existing in the code as well is a outstanding section from 1993 that talks about for apartments and court apartments, which I want to clarify, this is not. This is a multi-household use, but is a condominium multi-household. Nonetheless, they're contributing the 200 square feet. And then within this older requirement, needing to provide 25% of the interior building envelope as open space. Now, this is not something we're declaring because it is within the code, but we follow the most clear or more present provisions if there's direct conflict, which here between this section and then the section specifically for the use that we're reviewing disagree. This was a antiquated provision that was intended to be replaced and then did not, and was just overlaid in front of, which is why we're not holding this property for the two reasons. It's not the same use and it's antiquated in that way, similar to when we have disagreeing setbacks for the same zone. The more recent and clear definition of setback is shall preside, despite there being two setback definitions in the code. And this is, again, the issue with not continually to have our code updated and cleaned out with some of these conflict and discrepancy areas. Okay, moving down through some of the less clouded sections of review is into the area requirements, is basically our density calculation, which they're meeting their density to the highest component of 9 units. Width requirements is related to lot. They're over sufficient, so their lot is big enough. It's not an illegal non-conforming lot or non-conforming lot. Location requirements, these are the setback locations that we need to identify. So being the front, sides, and rear. The mainframe structures being identified at 15 feet, 32 feet from the north, which is side setback, 17 feet from the south as the main frame measurement of the setback, but the additional structure components are, like you say, 9 feet from the property line or outside of the 7-foot setback, and then 12 foot 1 inch from the rear. The special provisions don't apply in this case to this particular use. And then at the end of this particular use parameter section, it kicks us to the supplementary provisions, which is a section provided to apply regulations across multiple zones as they apply. So not a particular use or a particular zone, just where it's required, they need to come here to reference. This is a slightly older style of code use versus specifically defining per use and defining out more explicitly. Everything in blue is non-relative. And then again, what we're looking at within the red is some need of clarification. Keith, again, in this last commentary for the Planning Commission, did not identify this particular element, but want to bring it up anyway, is the orientation of a building versus the frontage of a lot. And it had been identified dwelling unit to front on a public street. Now, when we read that language or the title of that section, that seems indicative of a front door facing the street. When we get into the actual description of the code, its main intention is to ensure that a property connects to a right of way. It cannot be landlocked. It must have a frontage to a street, not meaning the front door and not declaring a particular facade of the building as an orientation element. That's been consistent beyond 2019. And when I say 2019, it's when our previous planning director and myself were on staff, understanding the code. And from that date, we're interpreting consistently that way. Understanding, yes, there were staff before, and in a majority context, we're interpreting in the same way, but don't want to quote beyond 2019 because of not direct access to some of those decisions.
Okay, see, that clarifies my understanding of why it was not 15 feet rather than the 7 feet. Or why it is 7 feet, not 15 feet.
Right. And I think I see what you're saying. That's a great point. Let's dig into that a bit more. Keith's understanding of these patios, yards was as front doors, that the front access for the property was to the south. The building definition is that the front of the building is to the north. The south facade is technically the rear use of the property, but it is the side setback and the side frontage of the lot. So within the lot, the orientation of the use can manipulate, but the standards for the lot must be intact, if that makes sense. So corner lots in particular are tricky. And as we're mentioning corner lots, I want to come up to our vicinity map here. Everyone can see that still?
Yes.
Okay. This Mill Creek pathway, this is a city-owned right of way. However, this is not a public street. We do have, of course, access to the ownership. So when we're talking about frontage, this property's frontage is along 200 South. So Bert Burton's access, you can see even within that Google map, identifies the access there. But as this property owner approached the design of the property, we're wanting to utilize this as a full street right-of-way, which would have required them to develop the full width right-of-way requirements of asphalt for two-way emergency access of a street, which would have required that they move the parkway to the 5 feet north of this area at best, if not remove the parkway altogether. Beyond that, the city has dedicated and has funding and a dedication of this area as pathway. So this is not a viable street access. Yes, it can be accessed, and currently within this property, that's something that's been in discussion with the property owner of how and when this property develops, that access is going to be mitigated. But this is one of the unique aspects of Moab that, of course, it isn't maybe meeting the standards that we would have with a new approval permitted in the way it is now. So with that, the property owner here wanted to maintain the orientation, fronting the parkway as a attractive amenity, but accessing directly off of 200 East. So I hope that clarifies at least that component of Keith's comment, and then also some of the Planning Commission questions. I want to take just a quick pause here. Are we doing okay? Are we understanding and in line with where we're at?
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. Thanks, Corey.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for your patience.
No, this is seeing the matrix with all the code provisions is very helpful, because you know me, I see the appeal and I see it written like a brief and I'm like, oh, we need to go through everything. So thank you for this.
Absolutely. Outdoor lighting, it was one of the concerns, again, not in the commentary, but originally voiced by Keith. Want to bring it up. They are under a current condition of approval to mitigate their lighting in compliance as much as possible. I know the Planning Commission is familiar with this, that the standards of 10,000 lumen per lot based on a density capacity is sometimes impossible to provide adequate safety lighting as it's required in circulation for engineering in the form of bollards, pathways, and portal entry within the building code. So what we're trying to work with the property owners is bring that lighting down as much as is possible without decreasing the required safety levels that are required by other code. And that's because of that 10,000 cap was a lumen count, lumens also being a challenging thing to measure, given there is not a consistent universal measurement for lumen. There are many, I should say, and that's what makes it challenging. That we're prioritizing safety. When the code conflicts, we get as close as we can, but safety will prevail in this case. And that's what we're trying to work with the property owners with that particular condition of approval. So that condition that was originally maintained is continuing to pass through onto this resolution.
And yeah, I think I would say as the adjacent, if I were the adjacent property owner, that would be the one more even than people enjoying their yards and barbecuing and having fun, especially near the parkway, especially with, you're kind of in this more natural kind of little spot near the creek. Gosh, it would be very upsetting to have people's patio lights coming over onto my property, I think, as an adjacent property owner. So I'm glad we're taking that one really seriously and working with the developer.
Yeah. They've proposed the dark sky compliant lighting fixture, but it's how we're organizing and orienting those is the where we're resolving. Fences or walls shall be no higher than 4 feet in the front yard, and then may be constructed at a height of 7 feet. So if you go over up to 6 feet, over 7 feet, it has to be an engineered fence, which is being proposed here in some sections. So that is where that building plan set conditional approval is being applied. As the fences are proposed. Now we're engineering them correctly.
Sides of the property are going to have the taller fences.
My understanding at the moment is that it's this west fence boundary. And then I believed that this was going to be 6 on the south and 6 on the north. It was included in this plan set and the prior plan set with the building department. I think they even had call outs for the fences. Let me come back to that. I do believe we have those identified, but in the spur of the moment, I'm not sure I can locate them super fast. And it doesn't look like it's on this plan set, but they had submitted cut sheets with those fence plans.
Yeah, I couldn't find it in the materials provided. I was just
Okay.
in regards to lighting and how much that does or does not disturb your adjacent properties and neighbors. A taller fence can be lit in such a way to prevent light from spilling over into the other properties.
That's correct. And so, yeah, as we think about light trespass, even a single foot candle being a low level of light, that fencing all of a sudden now diminishes that ability for trespass even further. So as this property is wrapped in fence, it's going to further reduce that foot candle effect coming down off of the angled intensities of the lights. So this is where it may get slightly out of my realm in the form of drainage. This is something that's reviewed by the engineers within the engineered civil plan sets. But the basic ordinance that we're required to maintain, and this is, Keith does call this out specifically in his comments for the planning commission, is that drainage, surface water from the rooftops, lots, or irrigation ditches shall not be allowed to drain onto adjacent lots, streets, except for other written agreements between properties involved. Meaning you must manage all of your drainage per plan. I know historically within the site, it was an agricultural area and is now being converted to development property space. And with that, when a property owner comes in and develop, they're responsible for their drainage. So the concept that Keith's property and historic sheet flow should be allowed to continue on to his neighbor is actually in direct conflict with this provision. If as the Snook property develops, they must manage all their drainage, and they are not required to accept agreed or historic flows in the form of storm drainage, whether that's municipal or private. Sheet flow is not a protected form of drainage system to be maintained. Keith does also discuss the concept of prescriptive right, which is a viable option, but prescriptive right must be pursued through adjudication. It cannot be applied. This would be I apologize to our attorney. I'm forgetting the particular language here on what currently is being a statement of prescription, but is not a declaration of prescription or a maintenance. So there are no existing easements, agreements that maintain that drainage needs to be historically passed onto this property. And that goes for the same for the property owner to the south, is that nobody else can have their drainage shoved onto his from either the south or the north. I know he's understanding, as both the property to his south and now this property to his north are developing, it creates an inlet for his property. And that's something that with the engineering review and development of his property would be handled and mitigated. This again is slightly out of the planning review, but I wanted to directly mention that code provision is intact to protect properties in that way, both the property to the south and the subject property. Are there any questions on that before I leave that component of drainage? I will come back to irrigation.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, thank you. This was, again, this effect of street plan is something that Keith had brought up previously, not included on the current comment set, is wherever front or side yard is required for a building which abuts a public street or abuts a proposed street which has not been constructed yet, but which has been designated by the Planning Commission as a future street, the depth of such front or side yard shall be measured from the planned street lines. So that obviously you can see how that might have been a spark of clarification needed there, is that with the Mill Creek pathway being a right-of-way area, shouldn't they be designating or designing around a corner lot? When in fact, at the moment, this is not designed or defined as a corner lot. The frontage is purely off of 200, as there is no street plan approved for Mill Creek. I think that essentially sums that up. I can dive in further if we need to.
That makes sense to me.
The landscaping required section of this supplementary ordinance basically describes in the front yard, or you know what, for the sake, I'm just going to read it verbatim. Landscaping required, meaning where landscaping is required, it shall at least 70% of the area contained within a required front or side yard adjacent to a street. So street fronting yard, whether it be corner or not. This one, we're just identifying the 200 east side. In any residential or res ag zone shall be landscaped. Also, other landscaping shall be required in other zones as specified. What the property owner has provided here is basically 20 feet of hard surfaced with 95 feet of landscaped area. We've talked about this before, I guess, in an extent, is some of the base level of this code, again, was designed around the original town sites, which were agricultural properties developing into suburban neighborhoods. And quite literally, time-wise, it makes sense, was mid-century style subdivisions, meaning what I like to kind of call the white picket fence style development, where every house has a driveway that is 30% or, however, 10 feet. And then it has, because again, 50 feet is the minimum frontage of a developable lot. And the rest of it is yard. So you have your driveway with your little walk path, and then your yard and your door in the middle of that yard. And it was intended that they just row by row by row. That's how they are designed. So this is the section that perpetuated some of that mid-century style design. We obviously know Moab has not developed that way. It's always been unique and will continue to be unique. But they meet these standards. This section, it specifically talks about where landscaped screening, which is a separate type of screening. This is not, when we're talking about buffering or combination areas, is not a required landscape screen, meaning those dense shrubs or trees being used in lieu of opaque screening. So again, that's, they're in place for that. This is the buffering requirement for zones that we had talked about earlier. And then screening of mechanical equipment, which is being provided for the dumpsters. This is that open space requirement. It's a bit antiquated from 1993. Again, all the blue is non-relevant. I did also include the condominium developments requirements, as they will be going through Planning Commission to review for these, but they're pending. They're not at that stage yet. And now into the site plan review section of the code, which is more review section and review criteria than it is use statutes. But I did want to read these verbatim if I can. The applicable land use area, or excuse me, the applicable land use authority has discretion to impose conditions during the review process that address, and I'm going to skip to number 3, buffering of offsite impacts, and number 5, landscaping and architectural design. Towards that justification, discretionary authority for applicable land use authority is to impose conditions during the review process that address buffering of offsite impacts and landscaping design. This is where we understand, obviously baked into the code, whenever we use words like maximize or combinations or adequate, those are interpretive areas, unfortunately. With staff and with the commission, that we're working towards a less discretionary based or less interpretation based code. We're trying to make it as clear both for the developer and the public as possible right up front. This is, and when this code was designed, what was meant to give a lot of power both to staff and then also to the neighbors, which is, again, I think a good and essential part of planning our communities. But we also know, especially within the state of Utah, how strong the property right is for the particular property owners for development. So we're trying to balance this combination of input from the community on what is our record of requirements and our limitation on being able to impose an excess or an interpretation to a maximum effect on these things. So this is, again, one of the areas within the discretion to grant conditions of approval, and then within that impose conditions on the review process for how we generate those decisions. And it's to the best of our ability, just the most fair and clear language determinations. Beyond that, sorry, go ahead.
So Corey, that would essentially account for that very squishy, the more intense the adjacent use, the greater the buffer shall be language.
That's correct.
Which
and
means nothing fundamentally, but alludes
that's
to
right.
that. Okay.
That's right. Yeah, I think there's a number of examples in our code, and then unfortunately, even in some of our pre-annexation agreements where that type of language is utilized, and it puts staff in a really difficult position to navigate that. And obviously that is our duty to pursue that to the best of our ability, which we believe we've done, trying to create justifications and findings of fact that it's not being arbitrarily applied. It's been consistent. I think we have a record of level 2 planning approvals that have shown that consistency, and approvals with the Planning Commission in that way. Aspects of that might be identified is, while there is no adjacent use located in this area other than it being access area, when we were working with the applicants, we understood that the parking being associated on this north boundary, we were trying to buffer as much as we could, to be honest. And I know Keith mentions the terminology of difficult to develop. And I don't think when I've reviewed the planning commission, that was my intention, or I directly declared this as a difficult site. I think what we're identifying is that trying to navigate these different code sections can be challenging. And with that, the offset of, because there is parking here and they are screening appropriately there was increased vegetation required in the side areas to offset that proximity distance that they've reduced for that particular use of parking in that site. So this is another section of sensitive combination screening buffering area where it's increased trees and vegetation that are meant to go up and above the fence to more mitigate the parkway. But while they're interior to the lot, utilizing that space better. The limitation on vegetation in this area is purely drainage based. I think the applicants were willing to put landscaping in form of vegetation in, but it was essentially pulled down to drainage purposes, needing to convey that. And then this is also an area that is in the 100-year flood plain that is being mitigated. But you'll see the trees along the front, trees along the south, and then the portions of trees on the north.
You're doing
Now-
great, Corey. Thank you.
Thanks everybody for your patience. This is why we don't do this. And I want to be clear, we're never hiding anything within the reviews, and we can, from now on, we're going to share these criteria matrices. We may not go through them to this exhaustive length, but that way it can be on record that every provision had been identified and reviewed, as opposed to sections being missed or left out or intentionally evaded. I think this is just, that'll be our standard procedure from now on. But for this particular item, wanted to exhaustively explore all of these sites. Now, I think for the most part, I've covered this matrix as much as is needed. I think we've reviewed the property as much as is needed. We did not go all the way through Keith's comments, so I do want to finish that. As far as irrigation goes, we can see this irrigation line here. In the short context of this, Moab Irrigation Company, the owners of that line of irrigation, participate on the DRT review. So with that, the plan sets, we don't review the irrigation components. Our engineers, in tandem with Moab Irrigation Company, create and generate an approved plan by their standards. This is something where I'm not taking away from Mr. Burton's concerns or from Keith's. This is where I think the private provider, being Moab Irrigation Company, is could be included in the conversation, but it's something I want to kind of remove from the planning review context of this. It was reviewed, it was approved by Moab Irrigation, and then mitigated within our plans. We're not going to double check their work on their own utility there. We're picking up where the Keith's comments of surface drainage and floodwater management kicked in, and then he moves into concerns about irrigation and bypass. Our attorney, when we had reviewed this, there are state statutes provided for canal movement. So if that needed to be pursued, that would have been an option, but it had not been pursued at this point of approval. Keith does propose some concluding comments here, specifically about the difficulty of the site. And I don't, again, want to reiterate, believe that the site in particular is difficult. I would agree with him in actual fashion. I believe the site is fairly easy, especially in Moab. There are far more challenging sites to develop. But the way the code context is being framed and utilized, it makes it challenging for staff, is what I want to clarify. I think hopefully that covers, this was provided by Keith from the original landscaping design plan. So you can see in more color where it's identifying some of those spots. But I think at this point, stop sharing screen. I'd like to open into some discussion. I know if there's anything that's potentially been missed, I could come back to Mr. Burton's comment and address those. I feel I've
Yeah.
hopefully addressed Kaya's buffering question, the AEH question, the drainage question, and then specifically Mr. Burton's concern about the fence in particular and how to mitigate that. I do have a suggestion, but we can get to that after discussion. If I know there's some staff in the back set of this, if our attorney or anybody else has anything to contribute that I've missed, I'd also welcome that as part of this staff presentation side. But while we wait for them, if they want to jump in or not, I'd like to enter into commission discussions and any additional questions.
Is Nathan on right now?
Nathan is not. We have access to Clayton.
Oh, Clayton, great. That was about timely. I was like, is someone from Smith here?
Yes, I am here. If you have any questions, I think Corey did a great job going through the code and other components. But if there's other specific legal questions you have, please feel free.
Yeah, that was really, I mean, just again, you know me, I was making sure that we've addressed everything in the adjacent neighbors very well put together appeal document, making sure that we've addressed all of their concerns. If not this, then this issues of the buffering and the setbacks, I think seem very well addressed. I just want to make sure that we were crossing our T's and dotting our I's on everything. And it appears that if you guys have reviewed that, then I trust your determination, certainly.
I want to note that the review criteria matrix that we viewed tonight was a new review. So upon the appeal application, we re-reviewed from a totally fresh perspective the plan sets. So they were not, we included the materials because we didn't want to be removing anything from the original agenda packet, but that particular review was done currently. So it was to double check, to not say, oh, we're just going to carry through the same review that we had done previously. Yeah. This was a new review. So, which is maybe a good kind of conclusion on my part, is that upon the additional and secondary review of this property and the definitions that we currently have intact, and they were intact during the time of this approval, is that I feel the commission is inclined to approve this project on the consistency of interpretations from the last 3 years, 3+ years of code review. Not to say that there isn't need for clarification in the future on these things, but that would be, I think, my recommendation at this point. And again, to also say, from the planning perspective, we are always reviewing and approaching projects from a community perspective. What is our first obligation is for the health, safety, and welfare of the community. I understand that our obligation is also to the property owner to ensure that their rights are being reserved and intact. And so what that leaves us with is finding the exact language to ensure that the best preservation of rights is universally applied. And I know that for every project, no one's happy. The developer's often unhappy, and often neighbors are unhappy. And it's sometimes said that if lots of people aren't happy, it means you're doing your job. But we don't always view it that way. We want most people to feel that they're being heard and mitigated as best as possible. And what I would say to anybody that's reviewed this or listened along and disagreed, I encourage you to reach out to the Planning Commission, to the City Council, to say that's not how I thought it should be interpreted or how it should be intended. I'm not saying that it isn't. I think that is our job. We have the discretion to interpret to the best of our ability. But if we want to create a more clear community review, then then we should do that moving forward. And I think the planning commission is currently engaged in a lot of that,
Yeah.
both with our landscaping ordinance rewrite that had been going on for quite a while now, and then also our plans to rewrite and clean up our whole municipal code, which has been going on for also 3 years.
Yeah.
We're finally circling on that. So that's my conclusionary component of, I believe that would be a staff recommendation. Feel obligated to make at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a difference between complying and we can make it better, not because we necessarily have to, but because we should. I think legally it's very defensible, up to snuff, complied with the code, but the more clarity we can give to the public about what these things actually mean and how they're applied, examples, narrative statements. I know that other attorneys are like banging their head on the floor right now because we don't want to give that much sort of like, back ourselves into a corner. But I think for things like this, it is really helpful, to explain the difference between buffering and setbacks, for example, to explain how that applies with adjacent properties, that there is sort of a first in development aspect to it. Unfortunately, at least how it's written now, and maybe that will change. But as far as how it is now, that isn't incredibly clear unless you play in it all day long, like planners and developers do. So yeah, I would love to hear your suggestion to our folks who are adjacent property owners to the west with regards to the wall and the drainage wall. Unless Lindsay needs something.
Jammies. Thank you for allowing me to participate virtually for this. I apologize. We have some medical issues we're trying to resolve. So thank you for your patience with that. And also apologize for being a bit flustered to
No, it's
engage in
okay.
this. I know it was so complex that to articulate it was challenging. Hopefully it got better as we moved through it.
You did a really good job. Thank you for it.
Thank you. Yes, my recommendation. So upon the recommended motion for approval that was in your packet, and then the specific conditions that are in the resolution, I think those that are in the agenda summary are sufficient to address the resolution language, so that you're not reading the exhaustive lumen count conditions, but that you're acknowledging, yes, they are both there. Would be to also include a condition of approval that the west fence is addressed to the standard compliance of FEMA and engineering standards, and potentially pursue an agreement for maintenance on the property to be maintained by the property HOA upon completion of the condominium platting and CC&R requirements for that approval. So my hope through that language to address Mr. Burton's concerns is that we can't deviate from what the federal standards are, nor our engineering standards, but to fullest compliance of those. And then to ensure that they are being maintained correctly is to not encumber his property in a negative way. I know that's loose at the moment, and I would encourage Mr. Burton to reach out to staff following this to solidify what those concerns are and how they can be mitigated. I think the best we can do now is to add a condition of approval from the Planning Commission that be pursued by staff prior to, I'd say, keeping it in context, is prior to C of O of the structure, which is the way the other conditions are currently applied. So prior to C of O, those designs will have been explored by our engineering staff. That wasn't a very clear one-liner. So I think I would accept something to add on the record of an additional condition, which I think there's a subsection. Oh, I think we have it here. A subsection C of the comments that would be within the condition of approval, that the west fence be mitigated with concerns of the property neighbor to the fullest standards available. Of course, that would be a staff recommendation. We can of course word it any way the commission chooses.
Would that address your concern and leave the door wide enough, do you think, for your comments that you made earlier, as far as, I know you had mentioned you had talked to the contractor about pouring a cement wall potentially instead of the FEMA fence? I don't know what that would,
FEMA designation changed
yes.
and is creating a fence, the water can move back and forth. That's the problem.
So Corey, our comment, and I'm so sorry, remind me your name again. Burns. Great. That's what I thought it was Burns. Mr. Burns was saying that the concern was that the FEMA designation changed. And so there is a requirement for a fence where water can move back and forth now, which was the concern, not necessarily maintenance, but the fact that the adjacent property owner, the Burnses, didn't necessarily want the water to move onto their property.
Yeah, water comes from our place to start.
Yep.
I have to do it back and forth. Can't keep the water on.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of things with the FEMA floodplain requirements, irrigation drainage issues to be addressed. I'm wondering if a catch-all would keep the conversation open and highlight and put a big blinking light on that issue as things move forward, certainly with the adjacent property owners, the developers, and then meeting whatever federal requirements they need to meet. Wow.
Yeah, the development must submit and supply a floodplain development permit, and through that, the appropriate plans would be reviewed and approved through the engineers concurrently with the development. And again, I would say that when it comes to floodplain, we have limited authority on mitigative techniques, but it sounds like Mr. Burns is saying it's changed, and he's just saying he'd like to keep it similar to the way it was previously. I don't know what authorities of power we have to deviate from what the standards are, but I think what could be done is a discussion between the property owner and the city engineer on how to best address the particular concerns that Mr. Burns has.
Is that sufficient, sir?
Just so you guys are aware of this. And
Yes, absolutely. So Mr. Burns was just saying, just so that we are aware, it's on record, and that so city staff is heightened about the fact that this is a new condition that has been placed on the developer that they need to meet.
Yes, I think we'll have that as an additional condition on the resolution as subsection C to explore mitigation with the west property owner on flood purposes.
Thank you, Corey. And we will seek your assistance again when it comes time to phrasing that in a motion.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you mind coming up to the microphone? Thank you again. Mr. Burns just asked to make a clarification.
Vert Burns again. I didn't realize you were addressing the irrigation. The irrigation piping that is shown on the south side of the property is the project I've been working with Jared on. And that goes to our property, and there's no problem with what we've come up with. We've relocated it, and he is supposed to come up with the design for the catch box and the gating to allow all the trash in the street to be moved down to the drains. So yeah, that's all should be taken care of
Great.
on the particular drawing that goes through their property.
Okay, great. That's great to know. So at least that aspect of irrigation, I know Corey, you said that's a little out of the city purview, but good to.
Well, yeah, we do review as part of DRT, but like Mr. Burns has stated, it was reviewed and is being, I believe, mitigated correctly on those standards with the Moab Irrigation Company design.
Great. And thank you for your information and your comments. It's really helpful. We also have someone else in the audience who appeared about halfway through your presentation, Corey. I don't know if you're here to provide any sort of input or background or just to listen. Just want to recognize that. So
I'm just a representative Guantanamo, I just so they can see if there were any issues or any questions there, so.
you're representative of the developer.
No, the contractor, Jared. Williams.
Oh, great.
Guantanamo,
Okay, great. So we have a representative of the contractor here as well, Corey.
so. He didn't have any other concerns, he just wasn't able to make it, so he asked me to come just listen in and go back.
Okay. Great, thanks. Just wanted to make sure you weren't here to say something. We try to keep it a little loose as far as public comment, so. Any other questions, discussion, things that haven't been addressed to other commissioners? I certainly understand, Keith, and Ruben has all my papers.
Thank you.
I don't know why I can't remember his last name. I apologize. Mr. Harger, the adjacent property owner concerns. It is a major, and I also appreciate the fact that he was very clear that he was not opposing the development of this project, that it's great, that there's more housing going in, it's a nice project, but that, he wanted to make sure that everything was legally up to snuff, which I absolutely respect and understand. And again, will commend his very clear appeal that he wrote. I was very impressed. But I think, at least to my mind, I think everything in there has been addressed, explained. The buffering was the biggest issue that stuck out to me. The other things seemed a little more clear on the face in the code. So I don't know if y'all have any questions, other comments, any discussion, things we've missed.
No, it sounds like everything that I had a question about is being mitigated. That presentation was really clear. And the few things like lighting and drainage and buffering are clearly being worked through, and with an interest to Mr. Harder as well as to Mr. Snook. So
Great. With that, if we don't have any other discussion or questions for Corey or Clayton, who's also on, if we have any legal questions, we can entertain a motion. There is, as always, a recommended motion on the agenda summary. There is one condition with two subconditions, but pursuant to our discussion, our input from the west side adjacent property owner, the Burnses, to put a condition 1C on there, having to do with addressing drainage, FEMA flood fencing adequately. Corey can maybe state that again as how we maybe want it to be.
Thank you. Yeah, let me give Clayton, opportunity.
Yeah, let
Clayton.
me, before, the only thing I think we need to make sure we do very clearly on this is there's a requirement that we make findings and conclusions and condense those in writing as part of whatever the decision is. And the reason for that is so that it gives, if there's an appeal, they can look at specifically the reasoning and why the planning commission decided to do what it did. And then we can review that under the various standards of review as that goes forward. So Corey did an excellent job in that presentation. I think that matrix that he prepared incorporates a lot of the reasoning or understanding as to what or why the decision might be made on why it complies with certain components. If that matrix reflects what the planning commission feels is their reasoning, one thing that would be appropriate to do would be to incorporate that by reference into the resolution, so that that written matrix becomes part of the decision. Again, if it doesn't reflect what you're intending, then we can make changes or light item or go through some more specific findings. But if that is consistent, that would create a written finding as to why it complies with each of the various code provisions.
Yeah, thank you, Clayton. That's a really good note and a really good idea. So that would be, we have planning resolution 02-2023 that we would be forwarding along with a positive recommendation if we make a positive recommendation. Which I believe, Corey, because there's 3 of us here, would need to be unanimous to be a positive recommendation.
That's correct, except that it would be an approval. This is a planning
Approval, excuse
resolution.
me. Yep.
So it's a full approval, not a recommendation to council.
Correct. I'm so used to not being the
Right.
final decider of things.
Right. But yes, that's, yeah.
So we
Other-
have in the packet, there's planning resolution 02-2023, which is a conditional approval of the level 2 site plan if we decide to do that. We could also say in the motion for that we incorporate by reference the decision matrix that city staff used to reevaluate this application for the new level 2 site plan approval process. Great. Who wants to take a crack at it? And / Corey, maybe how would you recommend that we do that 1C language? You were taking better notes than me, I think.
Yes, I think the essence is captured in this discussion, which is on record exhaustively. So I think with the just saying that there is a 1C specifically to address and ensure that the mitigative efforts within, I don't know, Clayton, if you have a suggestion, but the standards for the FEMA designed fence are
Maybe condition of
acceptable.
approval that the west fence is addressed to FEMA standards and discussion with adjacent property owners.
And I think with that, you can just put as discussed in the record.
Yeah.
And you're instructing staff to pursue that. So I think you can incorporate the discussion that we've had into that resolution. So
Great.
that the language is a little simpler, because this is a complicated one to try to reduce in writing on the fly.
All right. Okay, I will take one for the team on this. I move that the City of Moab Planning Commission conditionally approve the level 2 site plan for the Cottonwood Condominiums 2022 project on property located at 214 South, 200 East, Moab, Utah 84532, with the following condition. 1, all comments shall be addressed to the satisfaction of the Moab City Planning Director prior to building permit application certificate of occupancy. These comments include: A, the applicant will need to submit for condominium plat approval if the applicant is proposing to sell the units individually. B, finalize the coordinated lighting, design, and illumination plan. And C, address west side and all fencing up to FEMA standards as discussed on the record this evening extensively. We also would like to incorporate the decision matrix done by city staff for this level 2 site plan approval recommendation into the, oh goodness, planning resolution 02-2023. Do I have a second?
You definitely have a second.
Okay, I have a second by Ruben. Any discussion or any clarification that we need to make? Is that sufficient, Corey?
Thank you. That was an appropriate motion. Thank you for making that very clear. That helps. I do want to say, if there are any upon the discussion now at this point, as it opens to the Planning Commission again, determinations for denial, just to the same consequence, please supply your findings upon the denial. But I think you guys, you know how to do that at this point, but I think that's from staff. Thank you very much.
Great. Anything to say, Miles, Ruben?
Go ahead.
You go ahead.
Just kind of another backing for making sure that that's all taken care of in the motion. That first bit about being everything up to the understanding of the director, that kind of fits that as well, because this will all go back to you, Corey. And so I think
For the
that's all
conditions?
really necessary.
Yeah.
Correct.
And so
Correct.
that's
It's a
another
staff
point.
verification before. If you'd like to change that to a different authority, we can certainly do that. It's typically designated as the zoning administrator, which of course can change from whether it's Chuck as the engineer or Barry as the building official. In this case, these are mostly planning related. But whatever you'd like to do, we can certainly accommodate a different land use authority for that clarification.
I'd like you to have the authority.
I think that is how it is. That would be sort of the default here with the planning questions.
Works.
Miles?
No, I agree.
All right. We have a motion, we have a second. Just for ease of listeners and minutes, we'll do maybe a roll call vote. Christina or Corey, whomever.
Miles,
Yay.
Ruben,
Yay.
Kaya.
Okay, that motion passes. Planning resolution 02-2023 with the conditions as amended and incorporated at our meeting this evening. Thank you, Corey, for that very long but very informative and important presentation. Really appreciate it. And
Thank you.
to Mr. Harger for the really excellent input and comments and involvement, and sincerest apologies to him that it felt like this came as a surprise. And this is absolutely why noticing is really critical and important. I'm really glad we were able to reopen this item and have to go through the site plan approval process again. All right. Great. And thank you to the Burnses as well for coming and providing comment, and contractor and everyone. Future agenda items. And then I have a procedural question at some point, Corey, after that.
Sure, thank you. We within the DRT are currently reviewing some minor subdivisions, which will be coming before council, as well as petitions for lot amendments. We do have some larger site plan projects that are a little further ways off, so we don't have anything prepared for you. I'm identifying at this next meeting, but we are attempting at our most I think it's the 23rd of March, next meeting, to propose a more or less final draft of our landscaping ordinance rewrite. Alexi's been working really, our sustainability director, pretty diligently at resolving that and getting that up to snuff. So I know we've had workshops in the past. We've had to sideline our other code updates. I know we're trying to act with some pretty quick turnaround on what we had been calling those hot topics, or a lot of the code areas that are in need of immediate clarification, for obvious reasons to resolve, just clarity and ability to develop cleanly. But that's being sidelined until we, I think, have a little more capacity to get those through. And then dark skies will be quickly approaching as workshops as a final draft as well, probably into April though. Christina, is there anything else that you can think of that's on the agenda for this next planning commission?
No, I think you covered it.
And we're so happy to have you again. I'll just say. Thanks, Corey. My quick procedural question was, and this may have been, it's hard with people coming and going, and I know we're going to have the vacancy again soon with planning commissioners. I think we're currently without a vice chair, technically,
Right.
because Jessa was the vice chair. It's been a while and I can't remember procedurally how to, but I would like to nominate Ruben as vice chair. If he will accept that nomination, which means you basically run the meetings when I'm not here.
Sounds good.
That's about on par for our formalities. I'll double check the bylaws for.
I don't know if I
procedural-
need to be if I need to be re-verified as chair either, probably. So
I'll
maybe
I'll
this is the
verify
next
within the
meeting.
bylaws.
yeah. But I just wanted to call to that, reading through the minutes from the meeting when I wasn't here,
Mhm.
that Jesso
Mhm.
ran last year. It sort of jogged my brain on that. So
Thank you.
Um,
That's a good
Board chair,
observation.
Is that annual that we're nominating you as chair?
I can't remember. I truly can't remember. I can't remember if it was when my term was last renewed.
That's how I recall it as well.
Yeah, which was
Well,
not
again,
this year.
I'll double check the bylaws.
Yeah.
Which also coincided with the end of the year. So
Yeah. So Ruben's term was re-renewed by council this calendar year.
Right.
Mine, I'm still in the middle of mine. So we need to get clarification on who's up when. We've had a lot of switcherooing.
Yeah.
But I would like to make a motion to appoint Ruben as vice chair in the absence of a current vice chair for the commission.
I would second that.
Ruben is seconding that. Yay, he accepts. We're gonna hear about stained glass, guys. All right. Can we vote on that? They're not normally on the agenda, so I don't think that's something that needs to be publicly noticed. If I'm remembering.
I think at this point, because we do have a quorum, I think we can advance that action that is
Yep.
an internal, non-public item. It's an administrative appointment.
Yep.
And then if there's a failure within the bylaws, it'll default and we'll just reconcile that correctly.
Okay, great. This is just in a if I'm sick next time I want someone appointed. Great.
Yeah.
So we have a motion and a second. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Great.
Cool.
Ruben is now our vice chair.
So I need a copy of Robert's rules.
Yes, you
Oh.
do. I have two. You want? Okay, great. I think that will do it for this evening. Corey, thank you. I know you have all sorts of personal stuff going on. I hope everybody is well and
Thank you.
taking care of everyone. So I adjourn this meeting of the Moab City Planning Commission at 8:02 p.m.